This video is sponsored by Linode. Anyone can build on Linode, whether you need a development portfolio to land your next job or you're ready to put your app into production. Linode can get you there. For $20 in free hosting credit, click the link below or sign up at linode.com/Traversy. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to my React Native crash course. So I did one of these maybe 3 years ago or so, and it's out of date now, and a lot of people have asked me to update it. So in this video, it's probably going to be about an hour long or so. We're going to talk about what React Native is. We'll look at some slides, and then we'll jump in. We'll install it. We'll get set up with React Native CLI, and then we'll look at some fundamentals, look at the built-in components that it offers, and we'll build a small shopping list application. So this is an introductory course to React Native. However, I would suggest that you have some experience with the React.js library before taking this course, because I'm not going to explain every little thing about React. I do have a React crash course and plenty of videos where we build small projects with React, as well as a couple Udemy courses as well. So first off, what is React Native? Now, we have the React.js library, and then we have the React Native library, and they work together. So when you build a web app with React.js, the part of it that displays it out to the browser is actually a separate library called React DOM. And React and React DOM work together to allow you to build front-end browser client-side applications. Well, React Native is something that you use along with the React library that can render out native components to a mobile device like an iOS device or an Android device. So it's important to understand that whether you're building a web app with React DOM or you're building a mobile app with React Native, you're using the same React.js library. Now, one of the biggest advantages to using something like React Native is that you have a single code base. And what I mean by that is if you have a company that wants to build a mobile app, in a lot of cases they want their app to work on iOS and Android. However, if you're just building it with the native languages, they're two completely separate projects. So you might have a Swift project for iOS and then a Java or a Kotlin project for an Android app, and they're two completely different code bases. You might have different developers. It's very expensive, so it's definitely a huge advantage to just have one single code base that can compile to both platforms. So you save, not only do you save a ton of time, but you also save the company a lot of money. So that's one of the biggest advantages to using React Native. So as far as requirements go, if you have a Mac, you can build, compile, and test iOS apps and Android apps. If you're on Windows, you can build for Android and iOS, but you can't compile and you can't test for iOS. I mean, there's ways around it. You can use a physical device, and there's some other software and stuff like that. But usually, if you're building with React Native on Windows, you're going to be building and testing in Android. So just be aware of that. And then if you're on a Mac, you can build and compile and test for iOS and Android. And I'm going to show you how to get set up. And even if you're on Windows, you can completely follow along with this tutorial. All the code is going to be, it's going to run whether you're on Windows with the Android emulator or on a Mac with the iOS simulator. Okay, so just like when you build a web app with React and React DOM, with React Native, you also have a concept of components. You have your own components that you create, but there's a whole boatload of built-in components to help you create native apps and native UIs. You have different categories like basic components, which include things like the view, which is like basically a container component, a text component, image, text input, scroll view, style sheet. These are all basic components, and you can look in the documentation for a full list as well. For the UI, you have buttons, you have pickers, sliders, switches, list views, so flat list if you want to display a bunch of items, like we'll be displaying shopping items, section list, and then you also have components that are platform specific. So action sheet iOS, alert iOS, these are components for the iOS platform, and then you have components like backhandler, the date picker Android component for the Android platform. Okay, so you have both agnostic and platform specific components, and then everything else that you can do in React, like props and state and all that stuff, that's all valid in React Native. Hooks, will actually be using functional components with hooks, but you can also use classes as well. All right, so I don't want to bore you too much with slides, so let's jump in and get started with React Native. So I'm at the React Native website, which is facebook.github.io/React Native. And if we go to the docs here, you'll see this getting started page, and you can use these docs as kind of a supplement to go along with this crash course. Now, there's two basic ways we can get started. One is the Expo CLI, which is kind of a wrapper that will run it'll abstract out and run your React Native application. And all you really need is Node.js, and you can even use your physical device to test with and run your app. However, I'm going to be using the React Native CLI. And when we use the React Native CLI, we need to have a couple things set up on our systems. So one is Android Studio along with the Android SDK. You definitely want this if you're on Windows, because that's most likely what you'll be using and testing in. And if you're on a Mac and you want to test for Android devices, you also want to download and install it. So you just want to go to developer.android.com/studio and download and install it. And I'll get into it in a second and show you how to create an emulator and so on. Now, if you're on a Mac and you want to test for iOS, then you're also going to need Xcode installed. And the best way to install that is just through the App Store. And then once you install Xcode, you should have access to the iOS simulator. So let's first go over how to get set up for Android. So you definitely want to do this if you're on Windows. So I'm going to open up Android Studio. So you want to download, install it. Open it up, and if you go to configure, you can go to the SDK manager, and you should have the SDK installed. Right now I have Android 10 installed, API level 29, so that's what I have on my system. You just want to make sure you have the SDK installed, and you might want to take note of where it's installed as well. And this is a lot easier now. You had to do a whole lot more back 3 years when I created the first crash course, but now you have the SDK, you download it, and that's pretty much it. You have everything you need. And then you need to create an emulator. So if we go back here to configure and then AVD manager, which is the Android virtual device manager, you can see I already have a Pixel 2 here, but if you want to create a new device, because you probably won't have one by default, you just click here, pick a device. I'll just go with the Pixel 2, which is the default. Click Next. Choose your SDK. So mine is this Q Android 10. And then click Next, and you can rename it if you want. Click Finish. And it's just going to create a virtual device, and you can actually click the play button here, and it'll launch the emulator. All right, so it's basically just an Android device. It's a Pixel 2 right on your desktop. And it'll show the home screen and everything. So if you're on Windows, you're most likely going to be testing with your Android device, your Android emulator. But I'm going to go ahead and just close this up because I don't need it, and close that up. And now for iOS, like I said, you need to have Xcode installed, and once you do that, you can either go into Xcode and open your simulator to try it out, or you can just go to your terminal and type in open-a simulator, and that'll start up the iPhone 11 simulator. And there we go. We just have a home screen, so it's basically like an iPhone right on your machine. But again, I'm going to close this up because we don't need to open it manually like that. We can open it when it comes time to run our app. So now let's get the React Native CLI installed. So let's see. I'm going to go into my dev folder here. And then from here, I'm going to install the React Native CLI globally. So I'm going to use sudo since I'm on a Mac. And then we need to install it with npm, which is the Node package manager. So make sure you have Node.js installed. And then install -g for global, because we're installing this global so we can access it from anywhere. And then React-native-CLI. Okay, so I already had it installed anyway, so that's probably why it went so quick. But now that's installed globally, so I can now initialize an application. And I can do that by saying React-native init, and I'm just going to call this shopping list. We'll be really creative here. Okay, so now after that finishes in 15-20 seconds or so, it's going to tell you how to run your application on both for iOS and Android. So for iOS, you want to just go into the folder, and then you can run React Native run iOS. You don't need npx because we actually installed the CLI. If you didn't install it, you can still run it using npx. And then for Android, so if you're on Windows, you're going to want to go into the shopping list folder and run React Native Run Android. Or, I mean, you could do it, you could run your Android emulator on a Mac as well. So let's CD into shopping list and clear this up. And before we actually run our application, I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code in this folder. So you can see I have all my files over here, which I'll go over in a second. Okay, I want to do that. I also want to install a couple dependencies that we'll be using. So we're going to npm install here, and we're going to be using some icons. And there's a bunch of packages that you can use if you want to use icons with React Native. The one we're going to use is called React Native Vector Icons. So we're going to go ahead and install React-Native-Vector-Icons. I just want to get this over with so we don't have to stop the server later and install it later. Okay, so once we do that, we just have to link the assets, the icons, by doing React Native, and then we want to link the assets from React Native Vector Icons. Okay, and then you should see this here, success, assets have been successfully linked to your project. And then the only other thing that I want to install is UUID version 4. I believe that's it. And what this will do is just generate IDs for us, because we're going to have shopping list items, and I want to just have IDs. And I mean, it's not something you need. You could just use math.random and use a random number, but I figured that we'd use this package. Okay, so now we want to run our application, and we do that with React-Native. And then we're going to do run dash and then either Android or iOS. I'm going to run iOS. And it should just automatically open this up here. Okay, so that took about 15 seconds or so. And what happened, or it was two things happened. It opened up my emulator with the, whoops, I didn't want to do that. Let's get that back. So we should be able to just slide up. Yeah. So it opened up the emulator with the boilerplate application, which looks like this. And it also opened up this window, which it's basically our console. So we can do console logs and it'll show up here. And it also runs the Metro bundler on port 8081. It compiles any of the JavaScript that the device doesn't understand. So this will constantly run in the background. All right. Now let's actually just minimize that, and we don't really need this. We'll just minimize that. And now we have VS Code open on the left, and we have our simulator running React Native on the right. So over here in the files, I want to look at the package.json first, just so you can see what this entails. Now, the only two regular dependencies that come right out of the box is the React library and the React Native library. So this right here is the same exact React that you would run to build a web app. You would just have React DOM instead of React Native. And then these two I just installed separately. So we have the icons, and then we have the UUID package. And then for dev dependencies, it's just development stuff like Babel to compile JavaScript, ESLint, Jest for testing. And then for scripts, we can run Android, iOS with these scripts here. We can test with Jest, and we can use ESLint. So there's not actually much that's included in here. Now, there's a lot of config files like Prettier and ESLint, Babel and stuff like that. I'm not going to go over that stuff. And then the Android and iOS folders, these are the native apps here. Okay, so all the native stuff goes in there. What we really want to focus on is our app.js file, because this is the entry point to our application, just like it is with a standard React app. You have your app.js, which is your root component, and then you have other components that you create and you bring in and you basically embed them. Okay, so this has, all this stuff that you're seeing on the screen here. And just to show you how fast it reloads, let's replace this step 1 here with hello world. And I'm just going to save, and you'll see automatically it refreshes, and now we see hello world here. Okay, so it's auto reload. once you save. Now instead of going over all this, I'm just going to get rid of it and we're just going to start from scratch. Now, just as if we were using the React library to create a web app, we can use either functional components or class-based components. So if you use classes, you'd use lifecycle methods like component.mount and stuff like that. If you use functional components, you can use hooks. So I'm going to go with functional components with hooks. So first thing we're going to do here, well, either way you would import React. So let's do that. We'll import React from React. And then we're going to create our component, in this case a function. So I'm going to use an arrow function, so we'll call it app. And inside here I'm going to return. Now with the React library, when you're using React DOM, you would probably have a fragment or even a div or an h1 or something like that. Now you can't use HTML tags, like I can't use a div here. We have to use React Native components. So up here I'm going to import two things. One is the view component and one is the text component. And that's going to be from React Native. And then down here in the return, I'm going to output a view. And inside here, I'm going to put a text component that just says hello world. And then we just have to export this. So we want to do export default and then the name of the component, which is app. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And you can see that way up in the corner here, it says hello world. Okay, so there's no styling by default or anything like that. We have to style everything ourselves. So the view component here, let me just open up the docs real quick. And let's actually search for React Native view component. So this is the most fundamental component for building a UI. It's a container that supports layout with Flexbox. So we can style our layouts using Flexbox. And it maps directly to the native view equivalent on whatever platform React Native is running on. And we can embed other components within the view. So just to show you a little bit about Flexbox, let's say React Native Flex, because it works a little different. What we do is we set a view to Flex 1 or Flex 2. In this example right here, this is Flex 1, Flex 2, Flex 3. And instead of being a row by default like it is with CSS, it's a column. So when you use Flexbox with CSS, like you say display flex, it makes all the flex items align in a row horizontal. But in this case, it's going to be a column by default instead of a row. Okay, so it's going to go vertically by default. And we can set justify content and align items so we can align things within it. So what I'm going to do here is set a style to double curly braces, just like you would with a web app. And let's set this to flex 1, and then we can use justify content. And we'll set that to center. Let's actually close the sidebar up. And then set align items and set that to center as well and save. And now you can see the hello world, the text that's inside the view here is put right in the middle. Okay, so we can use Flexbox with the view component. And then for the text, we can also style that. So what I'll do is set that to, let's do color. We'll set that to dark slate blue, and let's set the font size. And notice with these properties, it's not like the CSS where we do font dash size. We can't do that. It has to be camel case. And then we also don't do like 20 pixels or anything like that. We just simply do 20. So I'll save that. Let's do 30 actually. So I'll save that, and you can see that the style has now changed. Now this is inline styling. This can get quite messy when you start to build a larger UI. So you probably want to use the style sheet component and separate your styles out. So we're going to bring in style sheet, and then what we'll do is go down here and say const styles and set this to style sheet dot create. And then in here, we just pass in some curly braces, and we can create styles. So for instance, let's do, for the view, we'll say container. And what I'll do is grab the 3 styles we have in here and paste them in here. Just put them on separate lines here to make it neater. And then instead of doing what we did here, let's just have single curly braces like that, and then we can say styles dot container. And if I save, we get the same result. And then I'll take the text styles, the color and the font size, and let's create styles dot text. And then we'll go down here, say text, and paste those in. Okay, save that. We have the same result. So now we've separated our styles from what we're returning from the component. Okay, it makes it a little neater. Now, before we start on the shopping list stuff, I just want to show you a couple things. One is going to be the image component. So I'm going to bring that in from React Native, and then we're just going to put that right here. And this actually takes in a source prop. So we need to pass in an object, so double curly braces, with a URI, not an RUI, URI. And we can set this to an image URI. I'm going to do HTTPS, and I'm just going to use the random user.me API. So we can say /API/portraits/men/1.jpg. And then we're going to add a style and set that to styles.img. And then we'll go down here and let's add in img and set a, oops, we need a colon here. Let's set a width of 100 and a height of 100. So if I save that, you can see that it's grabbing this image and it's putting it in here with the image component. Now, if I wanted to make this rounded, I could use border radius. However, we can't use percentages. Like I can't do 50%. If I do that, I'm going to get an error. You might think, well, maybe just put quotes around it, and that also doesn't work. So as far as I know, what we would have to do is just take the width and the height and then divide that by 2, and that will make it rounded. Now I'm gonna get rid of this stuff like the image styling and the text styling here, and then get rid of the justify and align items. I just want the container to be flex 1, and then get rid of the image, and we'll keep the text but just get rid of the style. We're gonna replace this with our header component in a second, and then get rid of that image. We don't need that anymore. All right, so we're just back to square one. So now let's create a new folder in our, you want to make sure you're in your root here, and we'll create a folder called components, just like you would building a web app, and then we'll create a file called header.js. So this is going to be our header component, and like I said, you could use a class or you could use a function. I'm going to use a functional component, and I guess, let's see, we could just, we'll just copy this, I guess. And then in here, paste it in and change this and this down at the bottom to header. Okay, so that's the name of our component. And then we want to change, let's see, we want to bring in these 3, and then we'll call this styles.header. And then down here for header, we don't need to set flex 1. We're going to set a height. Let's do height 60. And let's say padding. Padding, I'm going to do 15. And then let's add a background color. Okay, and this is on the view that's around the text. So the background color I'm going to set to dark slate blue. And then on the text, let's add a style as well. So we'll say style equals styles.text. And then we'll go down here and let's make the color for this white. And then I'm also going to set the font size to 23. And then let's also text align to the center. All right, so we have our header component. Now it's not showing here because we need to bring it into app.js. So let's import header from, this is going to be from /components/ and then our header file. And then let's replace this right here, this text, with our header component and save. And now we can see the header, but it's blocked by this little panel right here. So I'm going to go into my main app container style here and set a padding top to the same as the height of the header, which is 60. So that'll push it down. Now we don't want hello world displayed, so let's change that to shopping list. All right. Now you can also do, props. You can use props and state and anything you can do with React within a web app. So let's actually let's make this a prop, this text right here. So in our app.js where we're embedding the header, let's call this title, this prop. So we'll set title to, let's say shopping list. Okay. And then to actually take that in here, it depends if you're using a class or not. If you're using a class, it's going to be this dot props. If you're using a function like this, then you're going to pass in props here, and then you can replace this with props dot title. And if I save, now we get shopping list. And we can take it a step further, and we can just destructure and pull out from the props by using curly braces here, pull out the title, and then down here instead of props dot title, just do title. So all the same stuff you can do with React DOM, you can do with React Native. We can even set a default prop. So if we go down here and say header dot default props and set our title to shopping list. So now if I don't pass anything in here, if I don't pass in the title, and I save, it's still going to give us shopping list because that's the default prop. And you can bring in prop types and do that as well. I'm not going to waste time on that though, but yeah, you can do all that stuff. So we have our header. I think we're all set to close that for now. And the next thing I want to do is start to deal with state, and I want to deal with the flat list component to list out all the items in our state. Now I'm using functional components with hooks, so I need to bring in the use state hook. Okay, so we want to bring that in, and then right above the return inside the app function here, we're going to have our state. So we do this by setting some brackets, and I'm going to call this items. So the piece of state is called items, and then we need a function to actually manipulate the state, and that's going to be called set items. And we want to take that from use state, and in here we have our default, which is going to be an array, and I'm just going to have some hard-coded items in here, shopping items. So let's set an ID. Now remember I installed that UUID component. We can actually bring that in here. So we can import UUID. I think it's version 4 we do from, let me just check this out. So npm UUID. And there's a bunch of different ones. I use the version 4. So, we bring it in like this right here. So I'll just grab that, and then we can simply call UUID with parentheses, and it'll generate an ID like that. Okay, so we'll import it like that, and then we'll set this to UUID, and then we'll set a text value, and let's set this to milk. Okay, and then we'll just copy this down a few times. We'll have 4 different ones here. So we'll say milk, eggs, bread, and juice. All right, so that's our state. So if I save that, let's just make sure we have no errors. Good. So I want to use what's called a flat list to display these in our UI. So let's bring in from React Native flat list, and we're going to go down here. Let's go right below the header. Okay, we want to still be within the main view here, and let's say flat list, and then I'm going to just go to the docs real quick. So React Native flat list, and it gives us an example, very ugly example, but you can see that they have some data here, and where they're embedding the flat list, they pass in a data prop with that data. and then also a render item function. So they can render whatever they want for each item. In this case, they have another component called item. So that's what we need, is a data attribute and a render item function that takes in a function with item. And they're destructuring it. Notice the curly braces. So let's go ahead and do that in our application. So with flat list, we'll say data, and let's set our data to items, which is our state, the items in our state, and then render item, we're gonna set that to an arrow function, and inside here we want to put curly braces with item. Okay, so for each item, then we have an arrow, and we're just going to put some parentheses here, and then let's render out a text component with the item dot, and then we can access the ID or the text field. I want the text field. So we'll save that, and now you can see that these are being rendered out. Now there's no default styling, so we have to handle that ourselves. Now instead of having this just outputting text here, I want to have a separate component for each list item. So what I'll do is import, let's go up here and import the component we haven't created yet, which is going to be list item, and that's going to be from components / list item. Again, we haven't created this yet, but we will. And then let's replace this with our list item, and this list item, it's going to have to know you know, what this item is, so we're going to pass that in as a prop. So let's say item equals, and then set that to whatever the current item is. Now if I save that, it's going to break, and it says unable to resolve module list item. So let's create that. I'm going to go over to components and create list item, capital L, capital I, .js. And from here, let's just copy what we have in header and paste that in here, and we'll change, we don't need the props here, get rid of default props, and change this to list item, and change this down here to list item. I'm going to clear these styles out, and let's see what else. So as far as what we want to bring in here, we want to bring in all the stuff that we have, but we also want to bring in something called touchable opacity. And this is basically a touch element where, you know, if you put your finger on it, it'll have some opacity for a second as you touch it. So it'll give you that flicker effect that you see in native mobile apps. And that's going to be the outermost component of this list item component. So I'm going to replace this view right here with that touchable opacity. And then the style name here, let's call this list item. And within here, we're going to have a view. Okay, and for view, let's say style equals, and we'll call this styles dot list, let's say list item view. And then in here, we're going to have a text component and give that a style of styles, and let's do dot list item text, and the text is going to be the item, which is, if you remember, we passed it in as a prop right here. So we could either do, whoops, this is, yeah, we don't want this. We could just do item like that. Okay, because we're using destructuring with the curly braces. Otherwise, we could do props. So we could do that, and then in here we could say props dot item, and then we want the text property. So we could do that, but it's better off just destructuring text. Oh, sorry, not text, item, and that way we can just do item dot text. All right, now we also want a delete icon. Actually, before we do that, let's just try and render this. So if I save this, this is what it's going to look like. We can dismiss that. Now we don't have any styles, so let's start to add some of those. So in here, we'll take the list item, and let's set padding to 15. And as soon as I save it, you can see the padding gets added. We'll set a background color. Let's set that to a light gray. We'll do F8 3 times. And we're going to do a border. Let's do border bottom width. And we'll set that to 1. And let's do border color. And we'll set that to EEE. Okay, so we have a very light border. And then for the list item view, I'm actually going to set the flex direction to row, because remember, it's column by default, which goes this way, which goes vertical. We want it horizontal because we're going to have a delete icon. We want it to go this way. We also want to put any remaining space in between the two items, which is going to be the text and the icon. So to do that, let's add justify content, and let's set that to space between. And then I just want to align items to the center. Okay, and then for the text, so we have list item text, and I'm just going to set the font size to, let's do 18. All right, now let's add the icon. So hopefully this works. Hopefully the assets were linked correctly. So we can import icon from, and this is going to be from React Native Vector Icons / dist, and then you can use material icons. You can see all the options. We're going to use font awesome. And then right under the text, so we want to be within the view, because remember the view is the flex direction row. So we have the text, which is one flex item, and then we have the icon. And this takes in a bunch of props, like the name of the icon we want, which is remove. We can add a size, which I'm going to set to 20, a color, which I'm going to set to fire brick. And if I save that, now you can see we have our delete icons. All right, cool. So that's our list item component. We're rendering it, as many times as we have items. Now let's work on the delete. So we want the delete to happen when we click here, and you notice when I click on this, we get that opacity effect. That's because of this touchable opacity. But I want to click on the icon and then delete from the state. Now the state is not in the list item component, it's in the app component. So this is where ultimately where we want to call the delete item function, and then what we'll do is we'll pass it in as a prop, just like we would in just a regular React app. So let's create a function here called delete item, and this is going to take in as a parameter the ID, so we know which one we're deleting. And we want to call set items because that's the function, that's what we need to call if we want to manipulate this state, which is what we want to do. We want to delete one of these. Now this set items is going to take in a function with a parameter of previous items. So we could call this what we want. I'm just going to call it prev items, and then we have an arrow function here, and this previous items is just going to be the state before we do anything to it. Okay, so it'll have all these items in it, and what we need to do is delete the one with this ID, so we can use filter for that. So let's return the previous items however we want a dot filter, which takes in a function. We're going to use an arrow function here, and it takes in item. So we basically loop through, and then we're going to filter out. We want to say if the item.id is not equal to the ID, that's what we want to return. So basically we don't want to return the one that has this ID because we want that deleted. And then we just want to pass in to list item as a prop delete item and set that to the delete item function. Now if we go back into list item, we can go on to the icon here and say for the onPress event, we want to call an arrow function, and we want to call the delete item prop, which is that function, and we want to pass in the item.id. Now right now it's not going to know what this is, because since it's a prop we have to bring it in here just like we did the item, like that. So let's save that. Let's go over here and I'll click this, and there we go. We can see that juice goes away. Now I want to be able to add an item as well, so now we're going to, let's close that up, and create a new component called addItem.js. All right, and then we'll just copy, I guess we'll copy the header again. Whoops. So we'll copy all that, paste that in. So let's see, for add item, let's change this to add item, and we'll just get rid of everything in the return for now. We'll get rid of this and clear out these styles and change this to add item. Now as far as the components we want to bring in from React Native, we want view, text, style sheet. We also want text input because we need a way to type in our item. And then we also want touchable opacity here as well, because we're going to use that basically as a button to submit. And then we're also going to bring in the icon because I want to have a little plus icon. So I'm going to copy that from the list item, this import right here. So we'll grab that and put that here. Okay, so for the return here, we're going to have a view that wraps everything. And then we'll have our text input. So our text input is going to have a placeholder. So just like with HTML, we can have a placeholder. We'll say add item, and then set the style to, let's say, styles.input. I'm not going to put the event in here yet, the onChange event. And then under that, under the text input, we want our touchable opacity. And we actually want an ending tag to this because inside of here we're going to have a text, but let's first add a style prop and set that to styles, and I'm going to call this btn, styles.button. And then in here we'll have text, and for the text we'll say add item, and for the style let's say styles.btn text. A lot of the stuff you're going to be doing in React Native is styling, unless you use something like React Native Elements or some kind of UI framework type thing. I also want the icon in here, the plus icon, so we'll go ahead and put that in. So in here, let's say name is going to be plus, and the size is going to be 20. Okay, and then for the styles, I'm just going to paste these in just to save some time. We actually don't need this. So the input is going to be 60 high. It's going to have 8 padding, font size 16. The button will have a light purple background, some padding, button text. So nothing special, pretty easy. And then we'll go ahead and save this, and then we need to bring it into our app.js. Let's actually put this up here, and then I'll copy this down, and we'll go ahead and take that, and we want to bring in add item. Okay, and then we want to put this, let's see, where do we want to put this? Let's put it right below the header, so between the header and the flat list. I believe, actually, yeah, let's try that. So add item. Okay, so now we have a little text box and we have our button. We can type in here, we can use this keyboard. Cool. Now this add item, we have to do a couple things. We have to have a piece of state for the text that is in here. Okay, so we're going to bring in useState. If you've ever dealt with forms in React, this should be very familiar. And then we're going to go down here and let's say const So text will be our state, and then set text to manipulate it. Set that to use state, and the default is just going to be an empty string. And then what we'll do is go to our text input, and whenever you have an input, you have to have an on change or an on change text, which is what we're going to use. And whenever that fires off, so whenever we type anything in here, we're going to call a function called onChange. So we'll just pass that in there, and then up here we'll create const onChange, and that's going to take in a text value or whatever you want to call this. And then actually we don't even need that. We just want to set text and set it to whatever that text value is. Okay, so as we're typing in here, it's changing whatever that text value is. I don't know why I keep typing defend. Oh, you know what? It's using this down here, just like it would on an actual phone. So that changes the state as we type in. Now when we click this add item, we actually want to manipulate this state, right? These items we want to add to it. So we're going to do the same thing we did with delete and create a function called add item. And let's pass in item. Okay, so for this add item, I just want to do actually we'll do the validation after, I guess. So let's just do set items. Okay, because that's what we want to do. We want to manipulate the state. We're going to pass in prev items with a function, just like we did for the delete, and then we want to return an array, and we want everything that was already there. So let's pass in here an object with the actually we don't want the object just yet. We just want the previous items, so we can use a spread operator with prev items. So what that'll do is it'll take everything within the items and put it in here, and then we want to add in the front of it a new object with a new ID. We'll use UUID, and the text, which is going to be the item that's passed in here. Actually, well, let's call this text. That makes more sense, and then we don't even have to do this. We can just do that because this is the same as saying, you know, text. Okay, so that should add it. Now we have to pass this in as a prop to add item. So set that to add item, just like we did with the delete item for the list item component. So we'll save that, and then in add item, let's go to the button or the touchable opacity thing here, and we're going to add an on press. Okay, so instead of on click, it's on press, and then we want to set that to an arrow function, and then run add item, which is a prop that we passed in. Whoops, why did it do that? Lowercase a add item. Oh, it's because that's the component name. Yeah, so let's actually bring in add item right here because it's a prop, and then this should be lowercase a. So we're going to call add item and then pass in whatever the text value is. So the text state, which is getting updated each time we type in, so it's going to know what this is. So let's save that, and then I'm going to go over here and let's type in I don't know, steak, and then click add item, and it gets added. Cool. We can remove it as well. Now I don't want to be able to add nothing. You can see just add an empty string, and I don't want to be able to do that. Excuse me. And I want it to show an alert when we try to do that. So back in our add item here, actually let's bring in up at the top here from React Native, let's bring in alert. And we're going to go right in here, and let's say if else, and we'll take this set items right here and just move this into the else, and let's say if not text, so basically if nothing is typed in, we're going to use the alert component, which has a method called alert, And this takes in a few things. First is the title, which will just say error, and then the message, so we'll say please enter an item, and then an object that has to do with what we want on the button, and we just want the text of the button to say OK. So now let's go over here and click add item, and we get this little pop-up, this alert that says error, please enter an item. Okay, and let's type in steak, and there we go. All right, so I think that's going to be it. And, you know, I know this is a small application and it doesn't do much, but at least we went over the fundamentals. We went over how to set up React Native, a lot of the different, you know, built-in components, the really important ones like view, text, style sheet, flat list, and all that stuff. So obviously you could have some kind of back end where you could make requests to get data and insert data and all that. You could use async storage, which is kind of like local storage for React Native. You could use something like Firebase, so you could make this app much more complicated. You could add update functionality, and I would encourage you to do something like that. You know, either create something based on what you've learned along with the docs, or take this application and add on to it and make it better. But I will have the source code in the description if you want to check that out. And that's it. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something from this, and I'll see you in the next video.